next panel, which is on consolidation and whether or not consolidation played a role in the crisis. This panel is going to be lessons from the debate on competition policy. And we have Cristina Caffarra. Is she on the,
Yes.
Yes, I see you. Okay, very good. And Rohit Chopra, is he on?
Yes, I can see him.
Okay, let me see if I can see him.
Yeah, he's there. He's there, but he's muted.
Okay, great. Oh, here we go. Perfect. Got you. I see you now, Commissioner Chopra. So I'm going to moderate this as well. And again, just feel free to use the same system to send in questions, thoughts. But let's really use this panel to dig down on the issues of competition policy, of monopoly, of the role that monopoly has played in fragility. Commissioner Chopra, I think I'm going to ask you to start, and maybe you can kind of set the scene on where we've been really since the 1980s. I mean, we had a major shift in the US, certainly in competition policy at that point. We had a shift, thank you, Robert Bork, to the kind of, consumer oriented, as long as prices are falling, there's no problem with competition or monopoly. That worked well in some cases, but a lot of people feel that that's now been taken to an extreme. There are a number of competing theories about how we should be thinking about competition policy. Some of them focus on political power versus economic power, the sort of new Brandeis theories, the idea that we need to go back to looking at the political lobbying power of some of these firms and the political economy as an actual thing that we think about. There's also issues with the dominance of the big tech firms and the fact that we're moving from an economy based on tangibles to intangibles in this world of data. And when data is the new oil, does that somehow upend the rules of competition policy in ways that we should be thinking about? So I'll just set the frame that way, and perhaps you can come in and tell us how you think things have developed in the last few years, what role competition policy has played in the current crisis, and what should change.
Sure. So, Rana, thanks for that question. And I think it dovetails well with what we just heard about supply chains, that the traditional approach to examining mergers and consolidation is really rests on this ideology of efficiency, that making everything much more, stretching the rubber band more and more and more without really understanding that it can snap. And so I really have been thinking hard about resilience, about what does it mean to make sure that production and output can continue. I come from a background less about law and more about business, and supply chain management, as we've heard from others, it's really about the ability to respond and recover from shocks. And consolidation and mergers really put resilience at risk and actually can undermine an economic recovery that we're going to need to really focus on. So we heard earlier from Congressman Cicilline about a proposal to enact a merger moratorium in these moments as we rethink this, and that may be critical and timely because it simply cannot be business as usual for our economic policy going forward. We need to see that we have to be able to respond and recover. I think about when anyone is creating a factory or building a factory or a data center, boy, are they thinking about fail safes. They are making sure that there are redundancies. They're making sure that if one thing goes wrong, the whole system doesn't collapse. And in some ways, mergers are at odds with that. I think about it in a few ways. People think trimming the fat, that's just great, but what about the ability and the systemic risk of completely shutting down? So one, I think a lot about buffers. Decades of consolidation have really concentrated a lot of key sectors of the economy. And that means there's fewer jobs, fewer firms, less productive capacity, maybe less research and development. And in these times, that's actually what we need more of. We need more competition and in many ways, a bigger buffer to withstand these types of shocks, whether they be economic or, a health emergency. I also think a lot about agility at the local level, agility at the regional level, agility at the national level. We heard earlier, if you're waiting for critical medical supplies to be shipped across the Pacific, that is not going to allow you to quickly be able to respond. And if we see in the United States, as well as in the EU, much of the response is at that regional and local level. And to be able to get the key goods and materials to respond is just so critical. And it's not just about masks or pharmaceutical ingredients, it goes beyond that as well. So in many ways, consolidation and mergers, also really put that at risk. The last point is I'm really looking hard at the markets today, and I see something very similar to what we saw in the aftermath of the financial crisis a decade ago, that the largest firms are going to be able to quickly access special emergency credit facilities, other bailouts, while smaller and mid-sized firms are really on the brink and struggling. And so when those large firms can recover first, they can be ready to go in for the kill later. They can do more to scoop up smaller players at the regional level. They can do more to engage in killer acquisitions of potential competitors. And so if we're trying to think about both resilience in the context of shocks, as well as about what we will absolutely need to think as a country and as a globe about economic recovery, making sure that that buffer exists, making sure that there's that local, regional, and national agility, making sure that we are guarding against the mass roll-ups or consolidation that can occur later as large firms recover first. And I think no one is arguing that firms that offer lousy products and services should artificially stay afloat. In fact, failure and orderly bankruptcy is a critical component for a functioning market, but mass consolidation and unchecked mergers can really create systemic risks that, in fact, are very difficult to measure. And the current approaches that economic policymakers use and even antitrust enforcers, I don't think really is well calibrated to these types of moments. And I worry that the fixation on efficiency, that's dangerous and it's completely at odds with resilience. So, this pandemic and the proposed moratorium that Congressman Cicilline discussed earlier today, I think that's going to force us all to really rethink that.
Okay, I want to ask you one follow-up question. I also just want to remind anyone who's not speaking to mute themselves so that we don't get interference. Let me ask you, Commissioner Chopra, and I should have introduced you earlier as FTC Commissioner. How do you think about the role of the big tech companies at the moment? I mean, they're in a very interesting position. They were under a lot of fire for monopoly issues, competition issues before the crisis. But as we know, some of the companies that are doing best in the crisis right now are these firms. I mean, basically anybody who's virtual, cash rich, debt poor is doing pretty well. Some of them, like Amazon, are being considered, quite crucial to getting us through this moment. Others, like Google and Apple, are coming up with, coming together in new ways to come up with tracking mechanisms. They're getting into new areas like healthcare, financial data. I mean, these were areas that they were trying to get into before COVID, and there was a lot of pushback. Now it's like there's been a sea change, almost, short term anyway, in the public, how the public views this. How do you think about it? What what should we be doing? Are there, if we are going to allow more data gathering by these firms, should there be legislative limits put in place about how data can be used over what period of time? How do you see that?
Well, first, there's so many dimensions to this. One, I think many of us who are regulators, you know, my personal feeling right now is when there is going to be a real effort to engage in greater mass surveillance, the fact that the FTC and policymakers in the United States really haven't succeeded at putting together a real policy on protecting against abuse of personal data really worries me. Look, I think that one of the things we learned a decade ago is that there are certain firms in the economy that are the plumbing of our society and economic productivity. And we thought about that quite a bit in the banking context, which is that how a failure of one of those firms could lead to disastrous consequences for the rest of the globe. And, you know, in this situation, I've actually been asking myself a lot, what would actually happen if some of these large tech companies, what if one of them experienced a major shock? What if one of them experienced, you know, whether it's a physical attack or whether it was a major breach or whatever it might be? I worry about our ability to recover from that because it's such a fundamental plumbing of the economy. So in some ways, you know, my concerns are amplified about concentrating too much economic activity in a small set of firms. But, you know, we're also in the United States, there's a lot of discussions about the use of the Defense Production Act. And in fact, you know, policymakers are talking about what ways to use that. And I think there is concern about outsourcing key government functions into, you know, large, powerful firms and what the consequences of that are. So in some ways, I think this actually really sharpens our need to make sure that we really understand the consequences of consolidation, the consequences of firms engaged in, you know, thousands of acquisitions. And in fact, the FTC has issued orders to study those acquisitions by firms in the tech industry. So, you know, for me, it actually increases my resolve to make sure that we get to the bottom of all the potential harms that the current market structure may be exacting broadly on society and the economy.
That's interesting. You're touching on a question that's come in too about, you know, are there certain sectors that are absolutely necessary for human health, healthcare, food, water? Should those be left to the market? Should there be limits in terms of what private companies can do? And so we'll come back to that. I want to though bring in Cristina Caffarra, who's the head of European competition practice at Charles River Associates. Cristina, I want to ask you to sort of flesh out how the EU is thinking about competition policy in light of the crisis. The EU was already really moving in some interesting new directions before this. I mean, in particular, I was quite struck by the way in which Europe was starting to really put the onus on some of the big firms to prove that they hadn't engaged in wrongdoing, rather than creating a situation where small companies are forced to get into long legal battles. You know, I'm curious what you see happening now. I've heard some European commissioners and some staffers saying, actually, we're thinking of getting tougher now on some of the bigger players because we see that companies like if Google or Facebook can actually do a pretty good job of policing information flow and policing falsehoods during this time of crisis. So maybe you can kind of sketch out how Europe is thinking about all this at the moment and what other changes we might see.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity. I'm delighted to be on this panel for this timely conversation. I am indeed someone who practices in Europe. I've done so for many years, so I'm keen to really overlay a European perspective on this debate. But I want to pick up on some of the earlier themes that were teed up by Commissioner Chopra and by some of the previous speakers. To begin with, Foroohar, I think, said we cannot trust antitrust to solve the problems that we are in. And that is very much a position that I think is shared by many. At the same time, it is also true, and we cannot hide ourselves behind a different position, that antitrust has been, the way in which we practice antitrust for a long time has been significantly responsible for the position we find ourselves in now. Now, there is a significant challenge now to the purpose and the scope of antitrust, which is a global one and predates the current crisis. And it is one that really questions the foundation that we have been effectively following for the past 40 years, this notion that we need to have a more economic approach, we need to abandon presumptions about market structure and decentralization, we need to do away with public interest tests, with distribution goals, and this religion of efficiency as being the guiding light as to what we do. Chicago School has a lot to answer for, but essentially we ended up in a world in which the way in which antitrust is being practiced in Europe and in the US, but of course Europe has followed very much that Anglo-Saxon approach, has been we need to follow this god of efficiency. All we care about is somehow efficiency. In mergers, it means that we care about marginal cost, some small price effects, and we have led through all sorts of consolidation. We've seen mergers in sectors taking number of players from 10 to 8 to 9 to 7 in sectors like chemicals, in sectors like pharma. So the rethink has been prompted, I think, more recently, not just, of course, in the context of the pandemic, but by an awareness that somehow we let markets become concentrated, too concentrated. There is evidence that margins and concentration have increased, but it's broader than that. There is, of course, an anxiety over digital monopolies, as you mentioned. There is a notion that there is disempowerment, inequality, and generally systems when healthcare is broken, people are not serviced. So all of this is not solely the fault of limited lags for antitrust enforcement, but certainly lax antitrust enforcement, lack of it has been a very significant factor in it. So then we come to the current crisis, and this discussion has been going on about the faults of antitrust and the guilt of antitrust in some sense. We come to the current crisis, and this is then amplified, as we're all discussing here, for very good reason, because you have, of course, monopolies, and when you have or more concentrated markets in the front of these circumstances, of course, what do monopolies do? They restrict supply even more, they ration more. You have excessive concentration of production, there's by definition less flexibility. You have systemic risk and externalities, and again, we've been very liberal about allowing assets to go under foreign ownership when it comes to merger control, but now this paradigm of the open trading economy is very much under question. So this past liberal approach is very much a problem. So clearly, as a general statement, the pandemic has exposed even more and amplified even more a discussion that's been going on in antitrust circles, in policy circles for some time. We have applied antitrust in ways that are too narrow, too technocratic, too restrictive, without seeing the wood from the trees. We've been obsessed with efficiencies, not with distribution. We have pursued goals that are undeserving, and that's where we find ourselves. And of course, then you have the broad discussion about what we need to do to deal with that. And the proposal of Congressman Cicilline is certainly something quite interesting. Now, let me overlay on that briefly the European perspective, because what I've sketched is the global antitrust narrative. In Europe, there are some interesting strands which actually pull in a number of different directions. And it is going to be extremely interesting to see where we end up. Because, of course, in Europe, we've also been in the midst of a revisionism of the role and purpose of antitrust, sure, but it isn't been driven by the same American narrative that says we have let markets concentrate too far. There is some strand of that. Actually, Europe is in a different place right now. The political debate particularly now that Britain has left with Brexit, we are finding ourselves in a more French and German leadership of Europe, in which what is very acute is a sense of the fragility of Europe as a continent, effectively loomed over by US monopolies, loomed over by marauding Chinese, and we in the middle are actually pretty scared and pretty worried about what is going to happen to us. And the debate then now goes, competition policy needs to become much more a subordinate objective to industrial policy, because we need to deal with the position that Europe finds itself in. The position that Europe finds itself in is one of concern. Where is our industrial base going? How can we compete with all of this? So there is good industrial policy to which competition policy can be a co-player. Good industrial policy that's about, incentives for innovation, partnership and investment, favoring growth, that's good. But there is also another industrial policy, which is actually the one that is prevalent in the discussion now in Europe. And it is about effectively a defensive view of Europe needing to concentrate more internally, do Europe pan-European national champions in order to be capable of defending itself against global aggressors, including a strand of allowing government to take shares into national companies in order to reject potential predatory instincts by foreign companies. So really, actually, before the pandemic set in, we were seeing a complete sea change in Europe about the competition narrative and the role of antitrust. It not being an independent pursuit of efficiency, as it had been, more or less, with sort of qualification, but as a much more explicit tool of an industrial policy that is intended to pursue, in some way, the sort of strengthening of the weaker European firms. Not the inefficient ones, but there is a sense in which we need to then allow mergers to occur. We need to actually be laxer in the merger control that we've applied so far. The big discussion about Siemens and Alstom merging last year, prevented by the European Commission, today I'm not so sure this merger would be prohibited in the current circumstances, because it is very clear that the objective is a different one. Now, it is interesting because this narrative overlays, as you say, when it comes to digital giants, certainly an activism. The European Commission has been one of the most active regulators around the world to deal with digital giants. It has a number of investigations underway. I feel very smug when I talk to American colleagues and say, well, what have you done? Catch up with us. But it is true that this pursuit is continuing, but there is also a very strong sense we need to actually do our own data sovereignty, our own data autonomy, our own pooling of data. We need to append some of the unhelpful competition rules because they won't allow us to do that. So to conclude, I think that the developments in Europe are somewhat similar to the US. There is a strand that is aware that competition policy needs to be tighter, but there is also a very significant body of politicians and policymakers who are actually pushing in a different direction for a different policy objective. So that interplay will be very significant in the coming months and years.
Okay, you have set up so many fascinating topics, and I'm going to be calling you at some point for an interview because I love this. But let me tease you out on a couple of things, because I hear sort of two different visions here. I mean, on the one hand, Europe has been really ahead on thinking about monopoly, really setting, kind of setting the global policy framework there. But there's also, I mean, there is research to show, I'm thinking about Thomas Philippon's book, The Great Reversal, to show that actually one of Europe's strengths has been a variety of smaller companies versus these sort of, mega US or Chinese firms. So how do you preserve that environment? And, I mean, really in the midst of this crisis, that sort of Germanic Mittelstand, model seems very resilient, very robust right now.
Well, it is, yeah, sorry, carry on.
I'll bookmark that. I'm trying to get in 2 questions very quickly so I can get you on the move. And then we're hearing from listeners something that I wanna get you to speak to, which is the third way that Europe is sketching out in this new world that we've often, heard about a bipolar world, US and China, but in the case of supply chains, Europe is very much in the middle, being pulled constantly politically in both ways, certainly around 5G. The Huawei versus Qualcomm thing has been very politicized. Can Europe have a third way? What does that involve? And you mentioned industrial policy. I mean, do you imagine that Europe is going back more to a kind of a Franco-German system of national champions in all this? So maybe you can quickly speak to both those things.
I will try. I think that I'm a bit pessimistic about where things are going, because what the pandemic is exaggerating is certainly very much the framework of nation states, and we are, I think, in a situation in which there's been a German response, an Italian response, a French response to it, and I do not know, again, as one of the sort of sources of uncertainty where that is going to lead us at the end of this in terms of a vision. But you are right that the sort of SMEs, the Mittelstand in Germany is very much what drives the current thinking at the Commission. In a world in which Brexit has led to Britain kind of weighing anchor and drifting into mid-Atlantic on its own, this is a Franco-German Commission. Let's not make any mistake. And the protection of that Mittelstand, the protection of the German car industry, the protection of Airbus and of the French industry is very paramount, which is why you can see now precisely that. I worry about, to some extent, these instincts and these particular objectives coming to really mess up further what is a discussion about the role of antitrust, which should be, guys, we've been too lenient. We let things concentrate in ways that were not helpful on the pursuit of this efficiency myth. We are now possibly going to see actually even laxer antitrust, because we want to preserve and somehow protect the European environment. So I think there are a number of forces pulling in different directions, which we're going to live with. And that is, I think, an additional complication to the US.
Interesting. Let me, we're really at time, but Rohit, I want to give you a moment just to have a last word. And I'm going to ask you to respond to a question that's come through, which I think is interesting. Was James Tobin right? Has capitalism become too efficient? Do we need to build in frictions, redundancy, rather than eliminate them? What are the implications of this for the EU's core value of free movement of capital, people, services, and trade? But I think that you could expand that to kind of global systems in general. So I'm going to let you have the last word on this.
Yeah, well, look, I think this word efficient in some ways has become synonymous with stripping meat off the bone and hacking and cutting. There are things that make us more productive, but often that involves real capital investment. So I think the intersection with these global capital markets, where really a lot of the benefits and the fruits of production don't really flow to the regions and localities and the individuals, that does create some real problems. And I think it is true that the way we withstand shocks, whether they be economic or what we're dealing with today, or both, that's going to require a rethinking of how the structure of markets and the economy works. And, on this question of national champions, I just want to share something, Rana. I am worried that we're hearing, comments from people like Sheryl Sandberg and others that essentially it comes down to a few of these firms really need to be protected by the United States or their government in order to, position the West vis-a-vis China. I think this is a somewhat dangerous mindset. Because when we really look at where we've been driving innovation, it is often when we have a very large ecosystem of smaller players. So in the pharmaceutical industry, it completely depends on having hundreds or thousands of smaller biotech players. Even in technology services, consumer internet services, Facebook didn't invent Instagram, Google didn't invent YouTube. It requires this ecosystem. And yes, those large firms who sit on many, many billions of dollars of cash are able to act like a hedge fund or capital markets function. Yes, in that sense, they're driving innovation, but that can also be done in other ways. So I think if we look at the history of the US, we made, as a country, such substantial contributions in discoveries across science, technology, medicine, but it was partially because we believed in this idea of vigorous competition by not just 3 or 4 players, but by hundreds or thousands. So we need to remember that as we're looking to engineer growth out of this severe recession that we're looking at, and what are going to be the drivers of jobs, the drivers of innovation, the drivers of growth. And I don't want a few powerful players that are being protected by their country, to choke that off. So we need to be thinking about all of this as we go forward and create an economy that's going to get us out of this.
Well, you're bringing up a couple of really key points that maybe I can summarize and wrap on, which is that a lot of the private sector wealth that we see now concentrated in the top 10% of companies was in part government funded. So there's always a public-private sector dance being done here, but also that most innovation, and there's plenty of academic research that shows this, tends to happen in smaller companies, often before they go public. Those companies need to be protected. That's particularly front and center in the bailout discussions right now, which we would need a whole nother panel for. And in fact, I did that conference yesterday, so I won't go into that. But let me just
Rana, this is Angel Gurria. Just wanted to say thank you. I always say that Gabriela has the best job in the OECD, including mine, by the way, basically because she gets to speak to people like yourselves, and you're the ones who are helping us think about what's ahead. Our motto is better policies for better lives, but basically you're the one who give us the ideas about the policies, and we have to sell it to the countries so that they will have better lives. It's not always easy to translate from the better ideas to the policy, because we have to deal not only with economic policy, but also with the political economy of things. But again, thank you. So please, now back to you.
Thank you for joining, and really thanks to everybody, and to Barry. This is just a star-studded group of people, and I'm taking notes furiously and thinking of new column ideas. Barry, I'm going to now hand over to you, I think, for the next panel. Yeah.